Russian emperor possesses the supreme autocratic power, not only fear and conscience, but God himself commands obedience to this authority. Article 1 of the Fundamental Laws of the Russian Empire. The recent elections in Moldova were a prime example of everything old is new again. Not only were there strong accusations of various forms of Russian interference in the voting, to include outright purchasing of votes, but in the rhetoric as well, and most notably in the staging of a competition between candidates either aligned with the Western world or with Russia. It's easy to refer to this situation as Cold War Part 2, and many news organizations lazily jump to that handy description. But the truth is much, much older than that. We had planned to use this season of History, She Wrote, to show a direct connection between today's events and those of World War II. And there is an extremely strong case to be made for covering the Soviet annexation of Moldova in 1940 and comparing it to today. However, after much office discussion, we came to the conclusion that showing just how far back this conflict goes gives much better illumination of the situation. With that, we'll head to 1711 and the Russian reign of the man we know in the West as Peter the Great. But first, we should take an extremely abbreviated look at the history of Moldova itself, which was often known in history as Moldavia, parts of it as Bessarabia, and as Karabogdan by the Ottomans. Moldavia was a shining example of the beyond complicated issue of historic right in the modern world. A part of the Roman Empire, the borderlands of Hungary, independence, back and forth between Poland, the Ottomans, and then broken up by the Russian Empire, part of Romania, independent from Romania. Basically, an argument for just about any borders needed can be made with the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, as well as all of their independence. The borders of every single nation in Europe, aside from Great Britain, have been moved, finessed, changed, eradicated, tossed around, bargained away, extended, and violated. Populations have stayed, moved, married out, married in, and relocated both voluntarily and forcefully. And this was all the more pronounced for Moldova, which was the gateway invaders tended to take on their way to rampage the European continent. Constant medieval trampling takes a toll. By 1538, Moldavia was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. There were, at first, restrictions on Ottoman influence. They received a tribute payment, and Moldavia's foreign policy was not allowed to be hostile to the Sublime Porte. Other than that, they were allowed to govern themselves internally, and Turks were forbidden to own land or build mosques. But the Sultan was gradually increasing his reach, and by the beginning of the 1700s was appointing Moldavia's rulers with an eye to those who would be most advantageous, not for the Moldavians, but for the Sultan. And all of this was going down just as the Ottomans were being tossed from the very heights of their conquering Europe world tour. The defeat at the walls of Vienna turned into a massive push into Ottoman territory, resulting in the Treaty of Karlovitz in 1699. The Ottoman threat to Christian Europe was being beaten back. The Austrian Habsburgs, under the military leadership of Prince Eugene of Savoy, were ascendant. But Austria was not the only emerging empire. In Russia, a new czar with enormous ambitions and a desire to modernize in a very Russian manner was making huge advances. The Treaty of Karlovitz was signed before the young czar began his push towards greatness. And although he was a signatory to the treaty, he resented it tremendously. "They take no more notice of me than they do a dog," Peter said. "I shall never forget what they have done to me." Within a year, Peter, who was not yet the Great, and Russia were embroiled in the Great Northern War with Sweden. 10 years later, at the Battle of Poltava, Russia's victory was enormous. The Swedish army made that fatal mistake that Napoleon and Hitler would later confirm, invading Russia during winter, the most brutal European winter in 5 centuries. It worked out about as well for them as it did for future invasions. The Swedish army was decimated. Most of the army surrendered. The Cossack allies were killed, and the Swedish king himself barely escaped into Ottoman territory in Moldavia with his royal retainers. Now, it seemed that the upstart czar from the backwards east was someone to be taken seriously. He had pulled the mighty Swedish nation down from its heights. He had seized precious warm water areas on the Azov Sea from the Ottomans. And he was now demanding that the Ottomans, the medieval scourge of Europe, give up a fellow monarch. It was not a position the Ottomans wanted to be in. So recently, the terror of an entire continent had been in their hands, and at first they tried to ignore the demands, and everything would probably have died down there if the Swedish king had not been absolutely merciless in his demands for war. He could be quite annoying to his hosts. This all continued until November 20th, 1710, when the Ottomans finally gave in and declared war on Russia. Moldavia was about to become a battleground, but Peter had a few ideas up his sleeves to prepare a fertile ground for invasion. The first of these was to send one of his foremost representatives, a Ragusan merchant named Sava Vladislavich, the founder of Russian intelligence. Sava was sent first to Moldavia and then to Montenegro with the express purpose of fomenting rebellion that would benefit a Russian assault. Following his spy master and propagandist extraordinaire, Peter sent an advance force, but he sent them with explicit instructions not to pillage and to pay for everything they used. And also, he sent along a letter to be read to the Moldavian people. "You know how the Turks have trampled into the mire our faith, have seized by treachery all the holy places, have ravaged and destroyed many churches and monasteries. They have practiced much deceit. And what wretchedness they have caused, and how many widows and orphans they have seized and dispersed as wolves do the sheep. Now I come to your aid. If your heart wishes, do not run away from my great empire, for it is just. Let not the Turks deceive you, and do not run away from my word. Shake off fear and fight for the faith, for the church, for which we shall shed our last drop of blood." For the first time, Russia was positioning itself as the savior of Orthodox Christian world. It was the first time, but it wouldn't be the last. If you repeat something often enough, someone, somewhere, will believe it. Nowhere in this statement was Peter's actual reason for war, which was to seize the Swedish king and end that threat to Russia once and for all. It was as though, in his public proclamations of brotherhood, the Swedish king did not exist at all. Most of the Moldavian nobles, led by a man named Dmitry Cantemir, believed Peter and threw their lot in with Russia. Initially, the leaders of Wallachia did as well, but they were far more circumspect in their pro-Russian exuberance. Peter's army, about 70,000 strong, began to cross Moldavia. They were met by more than 200,000 Ottomans and betrayed by the Wallachians, who switched their allegiance back to the Sublime Porte and handed over all the supplies they were guarding for Peter's army. The odds were not at all in Russia's favor. They had to ask for a surrender. It was a Russian loss that laid the foundation for the transformation of Europe and Russia's rise as a great power. The leader of the Ottoman forces was not particularly interested in a fight. He was sick of the King of Sweden. The Ottomans had come off numerous defeats, and the Habsburgs were again kicking up dust on the Ottoman borders. He already had one irritating European king hanging around the Ottoman court. He certainly didn't want to deal with two. And the Tsar of Russia as a hostage might push other European nations into more fighting. No, the Grand Vizier wanted it all to just go away. The Treaty of Pruth allowed Peter the Great, who was as good as captured by the Ottoman forces, to ride out of Moldavia and back to the head of his own nation. He had to make steep concessions, but the leader who would propel Russia to the world stage was allowed to go free. One can only imagine the difference to world history had he been made a hostage. Russian fortresses were to be razed. Azov was to be returned to the Ottomans. King Charles was to be granted safe passage back to Sweden. And Peter had to pledge to stop interfering in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He agreed to all this, but balked at the demand to turn over the Moldavian ruler Dmitry Cantemir, who managed to escape in the Tsaritsa's baggage train, and later became a towering figure in the Russian court and in Europe. The Crimean Khan actually wept as the treaty was signed. He had been urging the Ottomans to understand the threat developing in Russia. King Charles XII of Sweden, not present at the treaty signing, raged when he found out. He never stopped trying to urge the Ottomans into a war against Russia, but was also never able to trigger further fighting. In the long run, the Ottoman desire not to escalate the situation with Russia was to their detriment. Russia simply kept coming. And although there were future defeats, they were also ultimately able to triumph. By 1774, a treaty was signed allowing Russia to jump in on behalf of the Orthodox citizens of the Ottoman Empire. In 1812, Russia was granted a large slice of Moldavia known as Bessarabia. In declaring himself the savior of Orthodox Christians in Moldavia in 1711, Peter the Great was playing a long game. The positioning of Russia as the head of the Slavic and Orthodox world, no matter what the rest of the Slavic and Orthodox world thought of the matter. Again, if you repeat something often enough, eventually people believe it. Moldavia was the first instance of Russia dipping its toes into the role of protector of the Orthodox and Slavs. And that episode of history is not merely echoing through to today. It's still ongoing. Of course, we only have 15 or 20 minutes here on History She Wrote to discuss the spider web that ties world events together. And so we've barely scratched the surface of Russia's invasion of Moldova in 1711, its rise to a great power, or current events. There is so much more to learn and know, and all of it is absolutely fascinating. The world right now is in flux, and it's more important than ever to know and understand history if we're going to be a part of making a better future. The real stories are out there. We need to hear them.